They cannot continue down this road. Joe Biden's words, blunt talk on Israel, putting to bed any speculation the U.S. president would reward Benjamin Netanyahu with a White House visit soon. This after the prime minister paused his overhaul of the judiciary. As we'll see, it's not the first time Biden's crossed swords with Netanyahu. Netanyahu's own son, without proof, accuses Washington of fomenting the mass protests against the reform. A Trump-like move? We'll listen to Biden and ask how much his words are moving the dial in an Israel torn apart over what the opposition calls a judiciary coup. For now, the reform is on hold while the president brokers mediation talks there. The opposition's suspicious. Can they trust Netanyahu's word? Despite the Monday pause, the bill's still brought out of committee, and the prime minister could, in theory, trigger a final vote of parliament at any time. How would Israel's top ally react then? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking, is it a breaking point between Biden and Bibi? Joining us from Tel Aviv, he's a former advisor to former Israeli leaders Ehud Barak and Shimon Peres, former diplomat Alon Pincus. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Good to be with you again.
Welcome from Washington, David Makovsky, director of the program on Arab-Israel relations at the Washington Institute of Near East Policy. Welcome to the show.
Delighted to be with you.
Marc Lefebvre, member of the left-wing Meretz party, is with us. How are you?
Yes, fine. Thanks for inviting us.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Boy, it's only Wednesday. The week began with a general strike, then a concession by Netanyahu, what seemed as well the unsacking of a defense minister who'd broken ranks with his prime minister. That's a lot to take in. So before we hear from the President of the United States, how about a brief catch-up session with Monty Francis?
In Tel Aviv, Israeli police used water cannons to disperse protesters who had refused to go home even after a major capitulation from Benjamin Netanyahu. On Monday, the embattled prime minister bowed to weeks of pressure and nationwide protests, agreeing to pause his hard-right government's controversial judicial overhaul for a month.
When there's an opportunity to avoid civil war through dialogue, I, as Prime Minister, am taking a time out for dialogue.
The move to remake the nation's courts would give Netanyahu's government power to select judges, including those presiding over his own corruption trial, a move widely panned as undemocratic. The legislation has sparked more than 12 weeks of protests and a nationwide strike on Monday that effectively shut down the international airport. Protesters say just delaying the plan is not good enough and that they won't stop until the legislation is withdrawn.
It's not a victory at all. This struggle will have to continue. There's no victory at all here.
Western allies, including the U.S., have also expressed concern and welcomed Netanyahu's announcement as a chance to buy time to find a compromise.
And compromise is precisely what we have been calling for, and we continue to strongly urge Israeli leaders to find a compromise as soon as possible.
Israel has its most right-wing and religiously conservative government in history, and for weeks Netanyahu has been facing pressure from protesters on one side and from his hard-right coalition partners on the other. The National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, had threatened to pull out of the coalition and only agreed to the delay on a promise he could form a National Guard under his office. It's a move opponents say would give Ben-Gvir his own militia.
Yeah, but Benjamin Netanyahu looking to his hard-right coalition as he engages in those talks brokered by President Yitzhak Herzog. And as you heard, skepticism on the part of those in Israel's opposition. Skepticism echoed across the Atlantic on Tuesday. Joe Biden, who's been in Washington for more than half a century, a staunch defender of Israel, hence the impact of his answers to reporters Tuesday at a stopover in North Carolina.
About Israel, how concerned are you about the health of democracy there in Israel?
Like many strong supporters of Israel, I'm very concerned. And I'm concerned that they get this straight. They cannot continue down this road. And I've sort of made that clear. Hopefully, the Prime Minister will act in a way that he's going to try to work out some genuine compromise, but that remains to be seen.
Are you inviting the Prime Minister Netanyahu to the White House, sir? Do you think he'll be coming to Washington?
Not in the near term.
David Bukowski, were you surprised at the forceful tone by the U.S. president?
Look, I've been hearing it from the White House publicly, you know, for months. Their preference and the kind of Biden-esque approach to Israel is solve issues behind closed doors. But when I think he feels that all these closed door efforts have not yielded the result, then I think the frustration kind of came out. I think it was an unscripted moment. It came just hours after the U.S. ambassador to Israel kind of said that there would be an invitation after Passover. But I think what you see with Biden is this is the authentic guy. And I think he's just been frustrated. The irony is it came out right after Netanyahu agreed to a pause and a dialogue. But I think this was Biden's way of trying to nudge the prime minister to say, look, this dialogue better be the real deal and not just a way to keep your protesters off the streets and your airports running and me off the telephone. So I think it's his way of trying to say, really, really cut a deal here that keeps Israel to have an independent judiciary that is not politicized.
Alan Pincus, do you agree that it was kind of an unscripted moment?
No, not necessarily. I think that if you take the points along the timeline of the American reaction, what began as a very gradual, even phlegmatic and bland response at the beginning, and you connect those dots along that timeline, you will see a graph of increasing intensity and an escalation in the American response. And I think there were about 3 or 4 events that caused the U.S. to realize that this is not just an average Israeli chaotic pandemonium type of political crisis, but a real constitutional crisis that is engulfing the country on top of possible escalation in the West Bank. First came the durability and the scale of the demonstrations and the protests. Then came an endless, as David correctly observed, an endless effort by the American administration to relay the message behind closed doors in a relatively soft and mellow language. That did not yield any result. Then came the dismissal of the defense minister. And, you know, at the administration, they're saying, all right, so here's a guy who keeps on preaching and advocating and pontificating about Iran and the proximity Iran is to a breakout time in terms of its military nuclear option. And this guy, in the midst of this supposed crisis, is firing his defense minister. How could we rely on this guy? And the last thing is what you said in your intro, and that is both Netanyahu briefing against Biden in the last 2 weeks, and his son tweeting conspiracy theories about the State Department funding everything. Take the confluence of all these and this impatience that's been growing with Netanyahu for the better part of the last 30 years, not 30 days. And you see that even if it was unscripted in the sense that what exactly he was saying came out from the heart, from the gut, I think this is something he was planning on saying for some time.
Yeah, just briefly on this, Alan, you hear him put the emphasis on the word genuine when he talked about he wants a genuine compromise. He seems like he's alluding to something, but to what?
Yeah, he's alluding to something very simple, and that is that Mr. Netanyahu has a tendency from mendacity and manipulation, and the Americans know this all too well. And I'm reminding the viewers and obviously you that Mr. Biden was vice president during a tumultuous period in which Netanyahu constantly confronted then President Obama, and they don't take him seriously. And they don't take him seriously because, as you said again in your intro, all these laws, this anti-democratic legislation that is presented as some kind of a judicial overhaul in the same sense that a bank robbery is financial reorganization. It's backsliding Israel on the democratic ruler, and this is something that Obama himself said he's running for president against. So in his mind, there are a lot of doubts and skepticism as to whether Netanyahu is serious. And by the way, parenthetically, without delving into too many nuts and bolts and details, just today, in a WhatsApp group message, the justice minister told someone who asked him that don't worry about it, we'll pass this legislation come July. So Biden knew exactly what he was saying when he emphasized the word genuine.
Yeah, because again, is a point worth stressing, Marc Lefebvre. Monday night, the president goes on television. Tuesday, we learned that this judicial overhaul bill has come out of committee and is ready for a final vote at any time between now and the end of the session in July.
Yes, I think it's a matter of, Netanyahu's game are less and less efficient, and the people do not really now believe in what he's saying. I mean, you can when he speaks officially, you can take every word, every sentences, and reverse it. Because...
But this is... I'm sorry, Marc. This is nothing new. We remember the hot mic incident where French President Nicolas Sarkozy called him a liar.
Yes, okay.
They know who he is. Everybody knows who Benjamin Netanyahu is.
The fact of the matter is that so far, a majority of the population in Israel still was confident that Netanyahu is strong enough to defend against foreign pressure and against the enemies of Israel. But now the fact that Netanyahu is losing the confidence of the allies of Israel is threatening the stability of Israel and the security of Israel. And what the Israeli population more and more realizes, despite the fact that a significant fraction of the political scene of Israel has said that since the beginning, now a majority is understanding that the private interests of Netanyahu are his priority versus the security of the state. And that the balance is such that he is ready, in order to defend himself against the jurisdiction and against the indiction, he is ready to sabotage and to harm the relationship with the strongest allies just in favor of his personal interest. And that he put his personal interest in balance and favors it towards the interest of the state. And the majority of the population who suffers from insecurity, who pays taxes, who sends his children to the army, who works and generates the profit of the country, is realizing that the government is ruled by people who, in fact, are here for their private interests and not for the interest of the nation.
They're discovering... I mean, politics is politics everywhere, isn't it?
Yes, but the fact that, for example, even somebody like the defense minister Gantz, who is in favor of the judicial overhaul.
You have Gallant.
Gallant, who is in favor of the judicial overhaul. The only thing he says is that due to the turmoil and the into the army, he asked for moderation and for patience. And the fact that he has been dismissed so violently was a shock to the Israeli population.
All right. Joe Biden's remarks, our correspondent Iris Makler, who we'll be hearing from shortly, she says they're really dominating the news cycle in Israel. Praise from the opposition, just one example, the blue and white party leader and former defense minister Benny Gantz taking to Twitter, saying President Biden sent an urgent wake-up call to the Israeli government. Damaging relations with the U.S., our best friend and most important ally, is a strategic attack. The prime minister himself, you could say playing good cop, bad cop in his reaction. Benjamin Netanyahu addressing the U.S.'s virtual summit on democracy, and they're playing the magnanimity card.
You know, Israel and the United States have had their occasional differences, but I want to assure you that the alliance between the world's greatest democracy and a strong, proud, and independent democracy, Israel, in the heart of the Middle East, is unshakable. Nothing can change that.
So that's Benjamin Netanyahu speaking to a virtual summit on democracy. Earlier on social media, it was a little more biting. Netanyahu stating Israel is a sovereign country which makes its decisions by the will of its people and not based on pressures from abroad, including from the best of friends. David Makovsky, Biden's criticism, kind of like the criticism we saw at a joint press conference between Netanyahu and the German chancellor a couple of weeks back. In the end, does that help or hurt the prime minister? After all, he can say it's us versus them.
I think you raise an important point, and that's another reason why I think Biden's preference was to do this privately until now, till the kind of the dam burst, so to speak, because what they did publicly, you saw Tony Blinken and you saw the president, Secretary of State Blinken and the president talk about affirming democratic values, but the goal was not to put the journalistic phrase, step on the story. The people who are protesting are Israelis. They're doing it because they feel that the very character of their state is on the chopping block if they don't come to the streets. And in many ways, they have won this round. We'll see if they win not just the battle but the war. But I think when I speak to people at the White House and at the State Department, they did not want to become the story. They wanted the people to understand that the people who are protesting, the heroes of this story are the Israeli people. And they were aware that people on the right would use any public statement to twist it, distort it in a way to try to delegitimize these people as doing America's bidding. So I think the U.S. tried to stay in the background until the dam burst for the president this week, where I feel it was unscripted, but this was. This has been building in him, and he's been talking to Netanyahu about this since this thing came out in January. There's a story out in the last few minutes, even as we're on the air, saying that the president sent a private message to Netanyahu after Gallant was dismissed, put a stop to this. So, but I think the administration was aware all along that if you are too out there in the prime minister's face publicly, his people will twist this in a way to say that these are people doing America's bidding. They're not. They're Israeli patriots who did this for themselves because they want to live in a Western, vibrant democracy.
Is part of this about U.S. domestic politics? After all, Benjamin Netanyahu has other friends in Washington. We mentioned it earlier. Getting a lot of attention, David, is the social media feed of Netanyahu's own son last Friday. Yair Netanyahu firing off a series of tweets and retweets claiming without proof that the U.S. State Department is funding the protests in Israel. It sounds like to some like a Trump-like move. So does Biden look at this and think, well, Netanyahu is campaigning for my opponent?
Well, it's a really interesting angle. There's a few things that you just said that really deserve very quickly to be addressed. One is these conspiracy theories of Netanyahu's son. And sadly, Israel's used to the fact that in the Arab world, there's a phrase in Arabic, the mu'amara, the conspiracy. But when the son of the prime minister is now doing his own mu'amara, his own conspiracy theory, I think it's a very sad moment in time. And it's to the extent the prime minister believes even a portion of this, tells me that his inner circle is shrinking in such a way that he's surrounded more by yes men and his own son. And that these people the son is abusing that to the point that the father might even believe parts of this. The old Netanyahu had people like Dan Meridor, Ehud Barak, Benny Begin, Bogi Yalon, all sorts of people who didn't agree with him. The new Bibi doesn't have any of these people. And I worry that the son has got way too much influence, along with some other people who are at the extreme fringe of Israeli life. The second point about the Republicans is fascinating because if you look, the Republicans, nobody broke from Bibi up until the pause. Believe me, people try to talk to Mitch McConnell here. People try to talk to Marco Rubio, Lindsey Graham, Bibi's probably best friend in the Senate, 3 senators on the Republican side, and none of them broke. As soon as the pause happened, they might have felt, okay, no one could say we're interfering, and they all said, but it's a good idea to talk. So it's interesting that the Republicans finally came out. A lot of pro-Israeli Democrats had sent letters, no Republicans had. But now they have. So we'll have to see. The one last point I would make.
Just clarify for our viewers. When you say broke, what do you mean?
I mean, nobody would tell Netanyahu anything publicly, or even we know privately, saying this is a terrible idea. This is going to alienate many Americans from Israel. And so he is, everyone understood here in this country that Bibi's very much more attentive to what the Republicans say. And yet they did not seem to want to get involved at all until yesterday. The one last point that's worth saying is that you've had a lot of American Jewish organizations, people very committed to Israel, and they have been alarmed by what's going on in Israel. And then some of them have gone to the White House to talk about it. I don't think the prime minister cares at all what they think, but the White House cares what they think. 80% of American Jews vote Democratic. And I think that if part of Biden's going public is that he does see a lot of the American Jewish community as his natural constituency. And if they are alarmed, he's going to be more alarmed. So I think while the prime minister might not care at all what American Jews think, he should know that if he cares what Biden thinks and Biden cares what they think, he should maybe care as well.
We're pleased at this time to welcome political strategist Dor Halap, consultant for Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party. Thank you for joining our conversation. Before I turn to you, I just want to cross, as promised, to our correspondent, Iris Makler, who is in Jerusalem. Iris, could we just get an update now? Because it's only Wednesday, as we said, and so much is happening every day in this story. We had 2 days of this mediation by Israel's president, Isaac Herzog. Where do things stand?
In fact, it's 1.5 days. He's called everyone in for a first round of chatting. He did it within hours of Benjamin Netanyahu saying, yes, we're going to have a discussion. And I just wondered how long it was going to kick off. He kicked it off immediately. He had already begun, of course, before he put forward the president's framework, which he called the people's framework. And the coalition dismissed that, within half an hour. So he's ready. He's raring to go. He's ready to go. And he's had all the different teams. And gee, there are a lot of them. So he's had the Likud team, each one of the opposition parties, even those who don't really believe there's any point in these discussions, even they have a separate team going to the president's residence. So I think it's going to be a very complex debate, unless he can keep it simple, what everybody thinks about each issue. I have heard from the Labor Party, who actually don't think that this is worthwhile pursuing, really, because they don't trust Netanyahu in the end. They actually want to stop before they have a discussion. But I have heard from them and from a number of other parties who have things that they would like changed, that they would like to see, including, by the way, an opportunity for something completely new, a constitution, a Bill of Rights, things that are not in the current scheme at all, but that would make a huge difference if you were really thinking about legal reform more broadly.
And how are Joe Biden's words landing in Israel?
That's interesting. The mature, if you like, political observers are worried. They do say, and I've heard a number of people saying from the morning, actually, we don't hear this kind of exchange. It's not so robust. Things that are said in private aren't said like this. So I think there's a bit of a shock to it, and that it's come out into the open does worry them. Those people say it weakens Israel, because part of Israel's strength within the Arab world, and indeed vis-a-vis Iran, is that America has its back, and that it's in that American nest. And now this implies that it isn't. But I have to say that on the Likud and further right, the responses have been, well, leave us alone. You have your democracy, we have ours, and thanks very much we're not interested in your comments, more or less with that tone, actually. One Likud party member who spoke before Netanyahu said if the president would only do himself the favour of inviting Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, to Washington, then he'd be able to hear for himself what we think of this reform. So it's all that kind of tone from the right, and much more worry, of course, from the centre and further left.
Dor Harlap, many thanks for that. Iris Makler, our correspondent in Jerusalem. Dor Harlap, your personal views on this.
Thank you. Hi, good evening. First of all, it's important for me to say that I'm not working currently with the Likud, but I'm part of the party, but I'm speaking on behalf of myself. So today, it's important to say we saw the news, and I've heard you speaking about it before, about Joe Biden's things. So it's very important to say that the state of Israel and the United States, we have a strategic partnership. It's very important for us, and I know it's very important for them. We lay on the same basic values of democracy and freedom. I'm not sure why Joe Biden have decided to interfere specifically with something so internal like that. I don't think that you in France would like to hear us or the States, United States, speaking about your policy about pensions. I don't think it's it's our issue to interfere with your internal issues. That's part of the way that I see that.
Well, let me ask you this, Dor. What would you do with your Joe Biden when you have the Prime Minister's own son, who is sending out these tweets claiming that the U.S. is somehow funding the opposition or funding the protests?
Okay, let's divide it to few parts. First of all, the Yair Netanyahu, son of Benjamin Netanyahu, does not hold any official position in the Israeli government. He doesn't affect the policy, doesn't have any specific way of affecting, okay? If he tells his father something that he believes should be happening, that's his own issue. I don't think he's deciding what's going to be or not going to be. And I think it's pretty obvious. And when people are trying to blame decisions on him, they're just trying to, to make it a political game. All the decisions that are being made by Netanyahu in the last few months are not his own. Okay, all the parties, all the slates that are in the coalition today in the Knesset have not just accepted, but also demanded by themselves to have this judicial reform. It's not something that Netanyahu's son is asking to have.
So what about the sacking of Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, a respected former military commander who is from Netanyahu's own Likud party?
I think this is a very, very sensitive issue this evening. And I would like not to farther on that, because I believe in the next few hours, we're going to have any advancement to here or there. But I believe that all the 64 parliament members, Knesset members, that are in the coalition, that are being appointed to be ministers and so, they all are trying and working towards having a judicial reform in that way or a little bit different. And only the disagreements are not about the essence, are only about the way and the tactics of how doing that. That's what I believe, and that's what I see.
Alan Pincus, do you see a window for compromise?
No. You want me to elaborate on that? No, because no, I don't. You don't negotiate democracy. You do not negotiate core values. Had the Prime Minister or any of his coalition partners approached the election with this concept or idea, and it would have been debated throughout the campaign, and then the coalition would set policy based on what they said they would do, then that's fine. That's legitimate, even if some people disagree with that. At the outset, at the inauguration of his government, Mr. Netanyahu made 3 pledges. He said that he has 3 priorities. One is curtailing the Iranian nuclear threat. The second was to expand the Abraham Accords to include and perhaps normalize relations with Saudi Arabia. And the third was to significantly lower the cost of living in Israel, which is atrocious. Not once did he mention a judicial overhaul or a regime-altering legislation. When he was initially asked to agree to consent to some kind of negotiations by the president, by President Herzog, about 3 weeks ago, almost a month ago, there was only one condition: halt the legislation, put it on freeze, and start negotiating. He refused to do that. Within less than 3 minutes of the president presenting a detailed outline, and that was 2 weeks ago, the prime minister said, no, legislation will go on. By the way, that's perfectly legitimate, but it does preclude the chance or the possibility or certainly the likelihood of any kind of compromise. Secondly, again, going to the nuts and bolts of Israeli politics, I just don't see the motivation on either side to reach a compromise because it's too late in the game. You correctly observed that legislation is out of committee and ready to be triggered into law within hours by a simple majority. You don't even need the entire 64 majority that the coalition has. So in that respect, it is disingenuous for Mr. Netanyahu to offer this kind of a dialogue and compromise. On the other side, I see very little inclination among the protest movement to indulge in this conversation because of what I stated before, because this was this was superimposed on Israelis by a majoritarian government without previous notice. So prior notice, I'm sorry. So I just don't see any kind of compromise happening. And I do see a constitutional crisis in the making, unless, of course, on his own volition, Mr. Netanyahu decides to stop this. But the dialogue, the negotiations, or the teams that are meeting right now will not produce anything.
And Marc Lefebvre, do you take Dor Harlap's point that seen from Israel, it can be seen as meddling, the words of the U.S. president, that you wouldn't want France's president telling Israel what to do?
I wanted to emphasize 2 points. First of all, I think it's very funny to hear the Likud representatives criticizing the fact that the U.S. government allows himself to somehow intervene into the political debate in Israel, when the Prime Minister Netanyahu for years has allowed himself to intervene into the U.S. political arena.
How?
And when for the brightest example is the speech of Prime Minister Netanyahu in front of the United Congress in March 2003, when he opposes, frankly, in front of the Congress, he opposes the policy of the elected U.S. president with regards to the agreement, the nuclear agreement with Iran. You have a foreign
2013.
Yes, yeah. 13. You have a foreign prime minister allows himself to speak in front of the U.S. Congress and to speak against the policy defined by the U.S. president. I mean, you have no such case in the history. I mean, you have not a U.S. president coming to the Knesset to say the opposite of what the prime minister is saying. You don't have a foreign representative allowing himself to come to the French Parliament to criticize and to mobilize the opposition against the majority. So it's very strange to see the Likud representative criticizing the fact that the U.S. is saying what he has to say. And second, about the possibility of a compromise. In fact, the Israeli press reports that before the dismissal of the Israeli defense minister, in the night between Saturday and Sunday, there have been intensive negotiations between representatives of the opposition and representatives of the majority with President Herzog. There were intensive negotiations to come to some kind of compromise concerning the process of appointing new justice officers. And every time somehow a proposal was crystallized between opposition and majority, the proposal was transmitted to the Prime Minister and was rejected because of the pressure of the Likud extremists. So in fact, attempts of achieving a compromise have already been attempted and have not succeeded. So I don't see how they can succeed. They can succeed now.
Well, we'll see with the words of the U.S. president, whether they somehow move the scales. Should point out, between Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu, two political veterans, long experience in dealing with each other's country and with each other. Take that time in 2010 when Netanyahu humiliated the then U.S. Vice President to Barack Obama, his government announcing 1,600 new housing units for Jews in East Jerusalem while Joe Biden was in town. David Makovsky, digging up archive photos, is that just the past? I mean, leaders are pragmatic. They don't dwell. Is there still a problem? Does Joe Biden have a long memory?
Look, I mean, I remember that 2010, what they call the Ramat Shlomo neighborhood. I know Netanyahu's point was that it was a municipal zoning commission meeting. I think Biden himself was okay. It was the White House that took it as a deliberate poke in the eye. Netanyahu said, look, I didn't know what the Jerusalem Municipal Council was doing on any given moment. When they said, well, you should have known. But
is that ancient history?
Yes, because look, the truth is Biden, I know this from the inside and I was in the Obama administration myself. Biden was always the skeptic of the Obama administration's belief that pressure works, that the Palestinians will do their part if the U.S. twists Israel's arm. He just didn't believe in it, and he's someone who genuinely, as I think we said at the outset, genuinely is a Zionist who believes that the world owes the Jews a state after the Holocaust, takes his granddaughters, I believe, to Buchenwald while they're teenagers. There's nobody in Israel who could say, as Golda Meir told me in 1973, and I've heard him give this speech, I think, I don't know, dozens and dozens of times, and he internalizes that speech where he says to Golda Meir, so Mrs. Meir, do you have, she spooked him with a briefing before the 73 war, and he was rattled, and she said, don't worry, we have a secret weapon. And he says, can you tell me what is your secret weapon? And he says, yeah, our secret weapon is we have nowhere else to go. He internalized that speech of Golda Meir. And if the government of Israel cannot get along with Joe Biden, it can't get along with any Democrat. 80% of American Jews vote Democrat. And he listens to when American Jews say, hey, we're worried about Israel's democracy. Why don't we hear the prime minister talking about how he's going to safeguard an independent judiciary? He never even talks about that. So while Netanyahu doesn't take, like I say, the Jews seriously, he does. But I think he comes from a place where it's very visceral, his love of Israel. I hope people don't misread this crisis. I think it's a crisis with the prime minister personally. It's not a crisis for the state. I think his belief in the state is rock solid. And I genuinely believe that that's who he is. This has been his life.
Dor Halep, does Israel have a friend in the White House today?
I believe that, first of all, I believe that Israel, the state of Israel, have friends, many friends, over the sea, over the Atlantic Sea, ocean. all the citizens of the United States, we share the same values, and I believe that our friendship is forever. Now, specifically by the White House, yes, I totally believe that we still have a strong ally, a strong friend, someone who will stand for us, even if for some reason he thought he should say something about our internal issues. I'm not sure why would he do something like that, but I believe that this doesn't affect our relationship. I believe that this is a small bump. It's important for me to say. And about what you have spoken before of interfering in the Israeli politics and funding some issues. We have in Israel something which was used to call V15, Victory 15. In 2015, an organization who was being funded by the American government was taking a part in the Israeli elections. We have been legislating laws after this was happening because we doesn't want to have foreign interference, even from our closest friend. But it's something that happened, okay? Like in the past, it's not something that was made up.
Well, can the argument be made?
By the way,
Dor, can the argument be made in reverse? One of those that's part of the negotiating team for Benjamin Netanyahu hails from the Coalet think tank, which is whose main backers are two U.S. billionaires who are supporters of Donald Trump.
First of all, there is a big difference between private money and state money. Second of all, I don't like it also. I believe that the citizens of our country should be affecting what's happening in our country. I go to the military, I serve in the military, I pay taxes. I should be deciding what's going on in my country. I think it's pretty simple. We're not closing our doors. We would like to have, being part of the global world. But in our democracy, we would like to decide by ourselves what we would like to do. Now, and still, I'll repeat, there's a big difference between private money for think tanks and state money for affecting elections directly. Now, I'm not saying that this was happening in the last few years, but we know for a fact that in 2015 it was happening. I believe that the policy has been changed since then, and I hope so.
Alan Pincus, what's your definition of foreign meddling?
Look, there is a certain level of foreign interference and foreign involvement that is short of meddling. Mr. Netanyahu has a proven track record of meddling in American politics since 1997 and 1998, when he colluded with then Speaker of the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, against Bill Clinton. He did it again during the Obama administration. In fact, he did it against Republicans in 1991 and was for 48 hours declared by then Secretary of State James Baker a persona non grata. So he has a track record in meddling in American politics. However, part of what he's doing is legitimate even by American standards. People go up to Capitol Hill, people lobby for policies, people lobby for foreign policy, people explain, people share, and people advocate. The Americans, on the other hand, have also been meddling, but there's a huge asymmetry here. The U.S. provides Israel with $3.8 billion a year in military aid. This has been going on since the Nixon administration in 1974. It was $3 billion then, it's 3.8 now. The U.S. has been providing Israel with a diplomatic umbrella, an almost ironclad diplomatic umbrella, since the 70s, casting 53 veto votes and abstaining only once throughout that period. The U.S. has been, mentoring Israel in every political form. So the U.S. has a vested interest in what's going on in Israel. Now, we don't have all that time, and it's a different conversation altogether. You have to understand, and I think David Makovsky alluded to it perfectly. You have to understand who Joe Biden is, not just 1973. Joe Biden, in 2019, when he announces that he's running for president, is saying two things, essentially. I'm doing it because there's a battle for the soul of America, and I'm doing this because the defining issue of our times is a battle between democracy and autocracy. He's looking across the ocean, and he's seeing Mr. Netanyahu, who proclaimed himself being in a bromance with both Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. So what Biden is basically doing is saying to Netanyahu, you know what, these are your friends, own it. You're on the wrong side of history. By the way, Netanyahu was allowed to speak at the, or invited indeed to speak at the Democracy Summit, but the Biden administration disinvited both Hungary and Turkey. I think that if this was 3 weeks from now, there's a good chance that in a humiliating way, Mr. Netanyahu would not have been asked to speak. So this meddling is going on both sides. I think that both sides, of the political divide in Israel are making too much of this meddling, and on the same token, then crying foul when the Americans are doing the same thing.
It's certainly going to continue to unfold. The crisis yet to come to a closure or a head. I want to thank you, Alan Pincus and Dor Harlop, for being with us from Tel Aviv. I want to thank David Makovsky in Washington. Marc Lefebvre, thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.